bed, bitch, go. Get up, and then they got go. Gotta wake up.
What is happening, fellow pioneers of human transportation? Something different today. I am basically just walking down to Hollywood Boulevard on the day before Thanksgiving. I'm just going down there to get some food. Also, the days are so short. Before you know it, it's like already like 2 o'clock, 2:30. There's only a couple more hours of light out, so I wanted to get out there while there's still sun in the air. Most of you guys know I'm still recovering from breaking my collarbone, so I ain't doing shit. I just been sitting around a lot, and it's extremely boring. So I figured I would mic myself up and tell you guys a story as I walk down to somewhere to eat. I'm not sure where we're gonna eat, but I do know what type of story I want to tell you. I want to tell you about my history as a weed dealer in California. I think it's about time that I release this story with all the details. Everything I'm going to tell you is incredibly old. It's been more than 10 years since I was a weed dealer, and it's been more than 20 years since I met some of the people I'm going to tell you about. So, okay, this is we're on Franklin, just north of Hollywood, and we're walking down to Hollywood Boulevard. And here's the weed story. Testing, testing. All right, the mic looks good. Okay, so basically, I started smoking weed not in college like a lot of people. I started smoking weed when I moved to California and I was 24 years old. Up until the age of 24, I had only tried a little bit of herb. I didn't really like it. It wasn't something I was going to be into. I probably had all the typical stereotypes about what cannabis was. So I had no interest in it. I think it's great. I think it's people who start smoking when they're 14 or 15. I think that's not very cool. I think you're better off starting smoking when you're fully matured. So I started smoking when I was 24. Smoked a couple times in college. Didn't really like it that much. And then I moved to California and I met a bunch of dudes. Then I moved to California and one of the first jobs I had was selling exercise equipment. I was working at this exercise equipment store with like 4 or 5 other dudes who were all like really fit, kind of typical California guys. They're probably all my age. I was probably 24, 25 at the time. They were probably early 20s to late 20s. But I noticed that every single lunch shift, these guys would vanish for like 10 or 15 minutes before we would eat anything. And finally one day I asked them, where are you guys going? And they're like, oh, we're going out to smoke some weed before lunch. And I was like, holy shit, you guys smoke weed? Isn't that bad for you? Isn't that like the devil's herb? You know, I had a lot of stereotypes. I'm from a conservative part of New Jersey where, you know, if you smoked weed, you were considered basically to be a burnout, a bum, a loser. You wore a leather jacket and a heavy metal t-shirt to high school. You know, you were a burnout if you smoked weed in New Jersey. So anyhow, these guys were like super fit, super normal. If anything, they all seemed very sharp because they were very sharp fitness equipment salesmen. They seemed like smart guys. They were in great shape. They looked good, but they smoked weed. And I don't know how I decided to get involved with them, but at one point I was like, can I smoke weed with you guys? And I don't ever remember actually going out with them for lunch to smoke weed, because it would be crazy for me as a non-smoker to all of a sudden smoke weed while you're on shift. So I started asking them for some weed. I didn't buy any, but you know, these guys had like, you know, modest bags of weed, and they'd give me like the smallest of nugs. You know, this was California in the mid-90s, and we already had probably the best weed in the country then. I didn't know it at the time, but I was getting these really amazing little sticky balls of weed that were just, they give me these little nugs, and I bring them home, and I put it in my pipe, and I started smoking it. And I liked it right away. You know, I knew I like cannabis right away because it's great for just general anxiety, low-grade depression. You know, I liked it right away. The second I smoked weed, I liked it. Probably what I liked too much about it was the fact that probably one of the things I liked the most about weed was I would smoke weed and eat. You know, I was already like kind of like a junk food junkie, and I loved like, you know, smoking weed and getting pizza, or smoking weed and, you know, eating cookies or whatever, but it just exasperated my sort of processed food problem, which I've had my whole life and I still have. I love junk food. So anyhow, started smoking weed at 25, and my habit just progressed then to like kind of what I am now. It's never really been, I would say the first 10 years of smoking weed, I felt a lot of guilt, and I only smoked at night. I never smoked during the daytime, and I kind of felt like guilt for smoking weed because I thought it was some sort of a bad drug. I'll tell you though, the last 15 years, I sort of had dropped any guilty association with cannabis. I realized that most of the things that I was taught about it were total bullshit. And living in California, I've met tons and tons of successful, heavy pot smoking people. People at the highest level, people who are in Forbes magazine for being like in the top 500 richest people in the world are opening, we're talking about shit, and they're telling me that these guys, they smoke weed. So it's just, it was very easy for me to become like basically a pothead, and I've been one all these years. And as far as I can tell, I'm doing pretty good with it. So then as far as how did I go from being a pothead to being a weed dealer? I think it was kind of a very typical path where, when you're, I can't afford to have a guy on a fucking skateboard smash into me with his shoulder blade. So, when you're first smoking weed in the 90s especially, getting the weed is a hard thing. So I had my connection, my one or two connections, and of course I had other friends that smoke weed, and anytime I would go to pick up weed, they'd be like, can you get me some too? I'd be like, sure. Probably at first I didn't really do it for any money. Eighths were like $60 back then. I wasn't really doing it for a profit. So maybe one or two friends would ask me to pick up weed for them. I would get it. I wouldn't make any money on it. But, being a good Jewish businessman, it didn't take me a long time to figure out 1 + 1 = 3. It's like, if I pick up for Joe, if I pick up for Pete, I should add a little bit to the price and make some money on it, 1 + 1 = 3, or 1 + 1 = more than 2. So it started, just every time I would go to get weed for myself, I would pick up for my friends. And, that sort of started to evolve as I started becoming a yoga teacher in my late 20s and early 30s. Then I met a ton of people who smoked weed, an incredible amount. And at one point in my life, I met my first real dealer connection, like a guy who would sell me a lot of weed at once so I could sell it to my friends. A lot just being like an ounce. I was a very small dealer. But I can tell you right now, I looked him up on Facebook. He's alive, he's sober. My first big time connection was a guy named J.B. Frank, who's in the band Kingdom of Come. They went on the Monsters of Rock tour with Van Halen and Motley Crue. The name of his band was Kingdom Come, not Kingdoms of Come. Kingdom Come was the name of his band. They sounded a lot like Led Zeppelin. They were known for that. But they were like a very big pop band. At one point, I think they sold 8 million copies of one of their records. But I met this dude, J.B. Frank, at the park, at my local park that I was going to pretty much every day with my dog. And, at one point or another, he made it clear that he had weed to sell. So he became my weed dealer for personal weed. And then I started buying more, and he gave me a discount so I could sell it to my friends and make some money. So my first connection was this hardcore ex-rock and roller with the classic long hair. And don't let me forget to tell you that he was also like an absolute heroin junkie at the time. This is also the first time I ever did hard drugs. After knowing him for a couple years, I did buy a little smack from him and tried smoking it, and I didn't like it, but at the time he was like a full-on junkie. I actually just looked him up on Facebook. That's what made me think about this. I looked him up on Facebook, and he's still like totally alive, and he's sober, so I'm really happy for him. He lives in Florida now, not in California. I know up until a few years ago I would see him out here in LA, in Hollywood. Anyhow, my first connection was J.B. Frank. And I started, spending a lot of time at my local dog park just with my dog hanging out. And imagine the world was smaller 20 years ago. It's like I made friends with everybody in my neighborhood. Nobody is staying home at this point looking at their phones or looking at Facebook. Everybody, if you want to do something, if you want to talk to somebody, you got to go outside. So the local park was really just the best place to hang out. And I made all these friends, and I'm not even that social, but weed brings people together. I made friends with interesting people. So J.B. Frank was my first dealer that I used to sell to other people, but my next connection came from a celebrity connection that I made in the park. And I'm going to give the names of these people up, sort of, because it's so old I don't think it matters. But when I moved here and I was spending all that time in the park, I became friends with a guy named David Silverstone, who happened to be Alicia Silverstone's brother, his actual brother. It didn't mean anything to me at the time. I didn't give a shit. He was just a cool dude, like a hippie type dude that I became friends with out here. One of my first friends out here in California. You know, he loved his dogs, so he's always brought his dogs to the park, and we'd always hang out with our dogs together. But he was like probably one of my first friends out here, and he turned me on to, and I'm going to give this name up. I'm not going to say the name of the assistant, but he turned me on to the assistant of a celebrity. He turned me on to Woody Harrelson's assistant at the time. Like, no kidding, 100% telling the truth, wouldn't make this stupid shit up. But I was buying my weed for resale from Woody Harrelson's assistant. You know, this was probably like late 90s, early 2000s, so it's over 20 years ago, right? I'm not going to say her name. She was a very cool girl. Sort of later in life, got herself involved with drugs and stuff like that, which happens to people, right? But I think nowadays she's sober and doing okay. But anyhow, you know, so my first time buying from her basically went to Woody's office on Melrose. And, you know, it was a solid referral. You know, David Silverstone knew me for a long time, trusted me. He knew Woody's assistant for even longer, so there was no nervousness or anything. But, you know, I walk up the stairs into this Melrose office. I guess I'm in Woody Harrelson's office, and I barely even believe it until I start looking at the mail. You know, there's mail on a desk. You're like in an office, and I see mail, and it's like Woody Harrelson. I'm like, holy shit. I guess David wasn't lying to me. So I would buy my weed from her, and I was basically buying quarter pounds from her. That was when, like, to me, that was like a big purchase, 4 whole ounces. And I paid crazy prices, guys. I was paying anywhere from $1,200 a pound to $1,600. That means that at one point I was paying $50 an eighth for weed for resale, but it was killer weed, and I was reselling it for $70 an eighth. So it wasn't like a huge markup or anything, but you know, it was very interesting, you know, buying weed from her, and she took care of me for years. She always had a good variety of stuff. Back at the time, it was like a lot of Trainwreck, a lot of Romulan, kind of these like old school strains that were very popular in Northern California that was shipped down to SoCal for resale. I made all these friends at the park, and, you know, we were all smoking weed together, basically just like going off into the woods and smoking joints, smoking bowls. And that's how I built my first customer base. And I'm trying to think of the years. This was probably mid 90s to late 90s, probably 95 to 97, 98 is where I sort of built like a base of customers. And then I sold weed basically for a living, also playing poker at the same time, all the way till about 2010, I would say. So I probably spent a good 15 years from like 95 to 2010 selling weed and playing poker for a living. Believe me, it was as good as it sounds. It was a great way to make a living. I felt like I had a lot less stress than many of my other friends did who were working stressful jobs. Not that selling weed wasn't stressful, because it was. Because for, you know, the early stages, like in the 90s especially, I remember being worried about somebody, you know, knocking at my door, and you're under arrest. You sold an eighth of weed to this guy, and we got you. You know, I mean, really, looking back on it, there was probably nobody prosecuting dealers at my level. You know, I was a super small dealer. I didn't also sell other drugs. I made it a point. I never messed with any other drugs. And I also, you know, it's not like I kept a gun in my apartment or anything like that. I wasn't like a real criminal in my mind, but I was always worried. There was always a certain amount of stress that I could get arrested for selling weed. So, you know, I made all these customers at the park, and then I also started, you know, in the early 2000s, really late 90s again, late 1990s, I started teaching yoga at the same park, and I also picked up a crazy amount of customers from the yoga world. I know there was a point that I was definitely considered like, yeah, he's a yoga teacher, but he's also a weed dealer. I remember somebody telling me he overheard a bunch of people talking about me, and they're like, oh yeah, he's a yoga teacher, like, and a weed dealer. You know, it was like, it was kind of interesting. At the time, I didn't think much about it, but it was kind of cool, like being the guy that you would go to get weed, you know? Like, gives you kind of like a little bit of power. And when you do that for a long time, you stop thinking about weed in the same way that regular people think about it, meaning that like you never run out of it. I forgot, like now that I'm a regular customer, it sucks that when I need weed, I got to go out and buy it. Although I still have some good black market connections, but like when you're a dealer, you know, I spent like 20 years probably never worrying about having weed or having access. I always had as much as I wanted, you know, it was crazy. And I was a pretty big smoker, but not like a crazy smoker. I probably, at the worst of my smoking habit, I smoked up to a ½ ounce a week. And I probably average about a ¼ ounce a week now. So it's really, what is what it is. I don't think that's a lot. I used to, when I first was getting into smoking, I thought an eighth a week was the right amount. But I eventually, you know, started smoking more, started getting into dabs and shit like that. So I'm confident telling this story because it's super old. I haven't sold weed for 10 years at least, and it's totally like, it's as legal as alcohol in the state, meaning you're not really technically allowed to like sell weed here without a license, but there's a lot of black market sales out here. If you think I'm buying my weed from the local shops, you're crazy. There's tons of like gray market or black market weed services out here that I get my weed from. So anyhow, that's a general story of a big part of my life when I was a full-time weed dealer. I think next time I do this walk and talk, I'll tell you about my life as a full-time poker player. That's also an interesting phase of my life that also lasted about the same time, ended in 2011 when the US banned online poker. So let's find a place to eat now. So here's Los Burritos, we're gonna eat here. What's up, buddy? How you doing? Pretty good, pretty good. How you doing? He knows what I want. Chicken burrito, please. You can make it to go. I'm gonna take it home. Thanks, buddy. Take it easy. Let's throw this in the backpack. I thought I could comfortably wear this backpack, but you know what it is with my arm is just like letting it hang free. It's fine for a while, but I've been out here for a little bit and it's already starting to hurt. So I think I can just put this on my left shoulder and I'll be okay. So, all right, so now we got to go to Target and get some snacks.
Hey Jay, what if I'm too stressed about my cover?
Alrighty guys, we got what we needed at Target and now we're heading home. I appreciate you guys watching this video all the way to the end. For the 5 people that made it all the way to the end, according to my analytics, that's about how many people are there right now. But anyhow, thanks for following along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment. I'll always talk back, and I'll see you next time. Hope you got something out of this tour.